Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Keisha Rogers. I'm a member of the LaRouche Policy Committee, and I'm happy to have you all here today because we are in an extraordinary period for mankind right now. People should really be extremely happy about the potential that's now been unleashed in the world. And to understand it, you got to understand it from the standpoint of not the soap operas of Days of Our Lives and As the World Turns, but tell me about it. I get an amen out here. But really, as understanding the evolution of mankind evolving into a new species, a new era, human era, as Mrs. LaRouche has said on many occasions, you have now the potential for mankind to enter into a stage of adulthood. And so I think we have to put that at the forefront of what's happening in the world right now, as we're looking at just on a microcosm what's happening right here in the United States, and the fact that you can't separate what's happening in the United States in terms of what we've been exposing as a all-out witch hunt by the enemies of mankind, the British Empire, against the President of the United States, but also in full against the people of the United States and against the people of the world. Because what you've seen is two systems before the world, as Henry Carey once called it, the system of feudalism and empire and slavery and poverty. That system is now coming to an end. And now you have a new era for mankind that's very rapidly emerging right now. And I think that that is the latest, one of the latest issues of our Executive Intelligence Review really details the potential for this new era for mankind.
Go up a little higher.
Okay, here we go. Okay, I wasn't in the light there. Which you have here. If people are not subscribers to our Executive Intelligence Review magazine, I would really encourage you to do so. The articles in it have been extremely inspiring and give you a sense of where the world is going right now that you're not going to get just by watching Fox News and any of the other media, but a new era for human civilization. And as you see, there's a picture of President Trump, President Putin of Russia, and President Xi Jinping of China. And we'll go more into that because as I continue to develop just some highlights of what has transpired over the recent week now, I would like to first of all say that our speaker today is going to get more into detail. Her name is Diane Sare, good friend of mine, colleague on the policy committee, visiting Texas for the first time. So she's in culture shock right now. Everyone say howdy. Howdy, y'all. All right, so, but now, I want to start from the top down here, because there's as I said, a lot of breaking developments. The dirt has been exposed on the enemy. But before we go into that, I think people really need a perspective of the beautiful future that lies ahead right now. And I can't do it more justice than what has been developed just this past week with the recent events in China. And China just had its 19th Communist Party Day convention with over 90 million people plus participating in this convention. The President Xi Jinping was elected again as party leader and leader for the people of China. And what he captured, in essence, in that speech was a march toward prosperity, and this with the conception of what has been the tradition of the conception of the principle of the pursuit of happiness, which we once looked forward to in our U.S. Constitution, and our Declaration of Independence as an inalienable right of mankind. And this is something that Mrs. LaRouche in her recent webcast really took favor to and expressed as a profound idea that the Chinese are not just talking about small infrastructure projects here and there, development for their own people, but to uplift, as they have already done, 700 million people out of poverty in the course of the last 3 decades or so, and now looking forward, as President Xi Jinping just did, to the next 35 to 40 years. He laid out a beautiful perspective for what the Chinese people, what China hopes to accomplish for the prosperity of mankind, a new era for mankind throughout the world. And I just have a couple of highlights from one of the speeches that he gave in the context of this conference to the CPC Central Committee at a press conference. He stressed the need to continue to strive to achieve the benefits of Chinese people and to eradicate poverty, and laid out a very clear vision and plan for the next 35 years on how China will continue to meet that goal for eradicating poverty. And he says, on the march toward common prosperity, no one must be left behind. He continues, the aspirations of the people to lead a better life must always be the focus of our efforts. I have no doubt in my mind that our people's lives will see further improvements year after year. He goes on in the press conference to say, we will act on the new vision for development and strive for sustained and healthy economic growth that benefits people in China and around the world. And what he emphasized is that in 2018 is going to be the 40 years anniversary of the development of the Chinese Republic. And the fact that what you've seen in the last 40 years in terms of the progress of China, not just as a upward sweep, but as individually looking at how do you actually develop the potential for every single person to be creative, to grow, to be prosperous in society. And this is there's a lot more on this that really can be brought out. But I think that, as Helga LaRouche made clear in her remarks just this past week in her weekly address, where she's really taken, I think this is the third one now, where she has been taking this potential that China has laid out for the world and making the point that you have to look at this from the standpoint that we've come to an end of an era, an end of a system, the end of the British the end of the British Empire, end of the unipolar world, the idea of keeping nations backwards, that we are at a point right now where the whole financial system of the transatlantic system of Europe, of what the United States turning its back on its tradition of the pursuit of happiness. Remember we had a fight in the United States, and Diane will go through this, which will make the point clear that we were fighting to rid ourselves and the world of colonialism, of the British Empire, and of this conception of enslaving mankind, enslaving populations. And now we're at a point where this can once again become a reality and greater. Now, what should be understood also in looking at these developments is the critical role that the LaRouche movement has played. We're not here just to give you insights, highlights of great ideas of what's going on over in China over there. That sounds nice, but what about us? Well, this is why I continue to emphasize the fact that the United States has been at the center of the fight for mankind. What China represents for mankind right now is it has a 5,000 plus year history. And the United States as a new nation has been a leading country in the past leading country in the world right now that has put directly at the center of its fight the fight against the British Empire and the fight against this system of enslavement. And you can see that by great leaders within the United States who have made it their prerogative to do so. And this has been the fight of Lyndon and Helga LaRouche. They share this common kindred spirit with President Xi Jinping on the conception of bringing forth a bold vision for the pursuit of happiness and the developments for freeing mankind and to eradicate poverty and to bring about this new era for mankind. And this is something today I will say that in New York, we have a special presentation that you will be able to hear later, which really emphasized the history of the Lyndon LaRouche, his ideas as not just a leading economist, but as a Renaissance man, as a statesman, as a world historic leader. And this is what has been missing in many of the people of our society, that you don't have people, the Platonic vision of mankind, that you're looking for out not for the interest of yourself, but not for the interest of your immediate family and how to live day to day and how to survive, but you're thinking about the world. You're thinking about what is mankind going to look like for the next 50 years. And this is a beautiful book, and one of our colleagues has just read and is working on some of the profound ideas, which is really interesting because in the recent period of what China has done to promote this conception of a march toward prosperity for mankind and uplifting the world out of poverty, not just China, the world out of poverty. This has been the life goal, should we say, of Lyndon LaRouche and Helga LaRouche. And this book that he wrote, which I want to put this up, is called Earth's Next 50 Years, was written by Mr. LaRouche in 2012, I believe this book is written. And it was, is that right?
Earlier than that.
Is it earlier than that? I think it
has to be. Oh, it's a collection.
No, it's 20.
It's a book.
Well, the copyright date says 2005. So
yeah, that's what
2005. Sorry, but this it's a beautiful perspective, because what I wanted to bring up just quickly in it is that what we're seeing right now, the developments of the world moving toward the New Silk Road, the Belt and Road, the win-win perspective of mutual cooperation for mankind. This was already laid out by Mr. LaRouche in 2005 and really going back almost 40 years now. And it is now becoming reality with what China, working with leaders around the world, has taken up. And we are poised in the United States to join with this new potential for mankind. For those who haven't really been paying attention, first of all, you must know that we are in a countdown for President Trump to go to Asia in coming up 1 week from yesterday. And he will be visiting China, he will be visiting Vietnam. He has the most recent developments that have just been put forward, as the president will go there to attend the ASEAN and the APEC summits, respectively, in these regions. And what has now been indicated, according to a Bloomberg News report, is that the president will be going to China, not alone, but with a delegation of about 40 leading companies. So the companies that are expected to be represented are General Electric, Electric, Honeywell. You have, I don't have it in front of me, it's a list of some of the major energy companies, major machine companies, and they're going to sign memorandums of understanding, sign agreements in terms of cooperating in energy and also development deals. So you have, they're expected to sign about billions of dollars of deals for U.S. investments. One of the investments is a multi-billion-dollar energy investment for the Chinese gas giant, the China Petroleum and Chemical Corp. And this is said to create thousands of new jobs that are going to be centered in the hurricane-ravaged areas of Texas and the Virgin Islands. So what we're talking about right now is that you're going to have the U.S. already starting, I think this is about a $10 billion deal that they're talking about right now. U.S. and China already, before President Trump even gets there, are working out the details for bringing the U.S. into this development perspective, this Belt and Road perspective. And this is exactly what we need right now. The key thing to making this a success is Lyndon LaRouche's ideas of his 4 laws, right? That for Lyndon LaRouche, as he's put forward, that you have to go back to a Hamiltonian national credit system. We're going to actually work the United States right now to make sure that the U.S. is fully brought into this perspective. And we'll hear more on this of the Belt and Road Initiative and the fact that Trump is taking 40 leading companies with him, and they're already starting to sign memorandums of understanding and negotiation for signing deals. And Texas is at the center of that. It's very, very interesting, very important. So now I want to switch over for a second here, because I'm not going to go through all the details, because I think people who have, a lot of people in here are very avid watchers of our website and are looking at these developments. But I just want to switch over to what we're seeing right now as a total breakdown of this coup and this operation that we have seen put forth against the President of the United States. And if people haven't seen it, I've made some copies of this outside, because to understand why you had to have a Robert Mueller, why you have this operation that has taken away and distracted the population from that beautiful future that China has so envisioned and given us, and Russia and India and the rest of the world right now is ready to join, the American people are ready for. You have to look at the fact that the operation by the British Empire and their cronies to try to keep the world under their control is failing big time. And we see this with the recent developments right now around the revelations that have happened, exposing the DNC, Hillary Clinton, and this whole operation around what has happened with the Russiagate, so-called Russiagate operation, as a total fraud, particularly the fact that Hillary Clinton and the DNC has been found guilty of colluding, not colluding with the British. So the issue has been not collusion with the Russians, but it's been collusion with the British, another foreign power, which is the British Empire. So if you want the details, I'll go through a couple of things, but we put out a very important article here called BAM, Hillary Clinton colluded with the British. Part of the coup is now exposed. So just to give you a sense of this, what happened was that as people know, there has been revelations and the development around Robert Mueller being assigned as Robert Swan Mueller. And if people want the deep lowdown on Robert Mueller, I'm not going to go through this because that's not part of the class today. That's a long history there. Read it. I can't believe I don't have one up here with me. Anyway, Robert Mueller is an amoral legal assassin. He will do his job if you let him, and he's not getting away with this. So, so people have seen this already. I hope you have read it already. But what you will find is that what has now been revealed is that the attorneys of Hillary Clinton and the DNC have admitted that the DNC was involved directly in paying for the Fusion GPS to do research, opposition research against President Trump. And it's now, this opposition research was paid to Fusion GPS, which hired Christopher Steele, a British agent, British citizen, MI6, former MI6. All the details are documented there. What's now been also exposed is, in relation to this, is that there's a article in the, I think this was in the Zero Hedge is where I found it, Republican group that helped finance Trump dossier revealed. And the importance of this right now is that, you know, that a group associated with, called the Washington Free Beacon, a news source, has now come out and admitted that it was also funding research, opposition research against, not just against President Trump, but also against other Republicans. And this opposition research was being done prior to Trump being the nominee. And what they conclude is that once they found that President Trump was going to, that he was going to become nominee, they dropped the research, and the DNC attorneys and the DNC leaders, through their lead attorney, Mark Elias, picked up this contract with Fusion GPS. So, and therefore went and continued to go on with this, with then the hiring of Christopher Steele, the British agent who was hired to put forth the information, this sexed up dossier against Trump, finding collusion with the Russians. So now you can find all of these details and more right now, because the point is, as said, this is not about the dirty lowdown, you know, as the world turns, you know, soap opera. It goes back to what's the intention here? We got to get, you know, because the people, I mean, you guys probably know more about these headlines than I do, because I don't like keeping up with all this stuff. But but I think that the key thing right now is that we are on the verge of a new potential for mankind. They want to stop this at all costs. They want they being the enemies of mankind, the Wall Street financial interests that's been pushing bailouts and pushing financial collapse, economic collapse, poverty. They want to do everything in their power to try to keep their system afloat. But what these revelations show, and what you're seeing right now, is that the dam has broken around this whole coup right now, and they have been thoroughly exposed. Now you have leading newspapers, the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, pardon me, and the Examiner coming out now saying that Robert Mueller should be recused. He should recuse himself. He should resign. And this is absolutely as a result of close to a month now, we've been getting this expose, this investigative report out, and it has made shockwaves throughout the nation. because of what it really details about who the real enemy is, who Robert Mueller works for, and why this guy has been against the U.S. joining with the Belt and Road, Russia, China, and the U.S. coming together to form a common bond for the interest of all mankind. So I think that I want to turn it over to Diane, because we have to get a sense of the role of the United States right now in this new direction for mankind in the world is absolutely critical. And right now, what President Trump going to Asia in the next week now is going to be the most important thing. This is what the airwaves should be just filled with right now. What's Trump doing? What's China doing? What is this new perspective for mankind? But we're filled with a bunch of crap and junk and division and destruction against the president of the United States, where right now the world is not even thinking about that. The world is thinking about something that's much more profound. So I wanted to end with, and this was actually played last night. I'm going to read it, though I'm not going to play it, in the presentation that Matt Ogden gave on the LaRouche PAC website. And I would just say that really goes a little bit more into detail. People who are not on our website, please go to the website, watch the latest webcast that was given on yesterday, on the Friday webcast. But this is from Mrs. LaRouche, and concluding in just this, in her one of her recent webcasts that she gave on this great potential for mankind around the Belt and Road, bringing the U.S. into the new Silk Road. And she's talking about President Xi Jinping's commitment to the pursuit of happiness and how beautiful this conception is. But she says, I think that this is an incredible perspective, because if you look at it from the long arch of human history, this was an initiative that had been made at a certain point in the development of humanity. There had to be at some point somebody to say, we are the human species. The human species is one. Xi Jinping always called it, quote, the shared community for the future of mankind, end quote. A vision how we can organize our affairs on this planet in such a way that the result of it is a good life for all people living on the planet. And I think that's what you're seeing right now, a vision right now that we can organize the happiness, the pursuit of happiness for every single human being living on the planet. So with that, I think that we have a lot to look forward to. I look forward to what Diane has to say and continuing to educate and to bring people into this beautiful perspective, and where the United States plays, as I said, a critical role in that. So we'll continue.
Okay. Hi. Well, greetings. Howdy. Howdy, y'all. Yeah, greetings from Manhattan. So actually, what I am going to do is a little maybe unusual, because we face a big challenge in the organizing right now, which is that Helga keeps saying there's a new paradigm, there's a new paradigm. Well, what does that mean? It means that we are, when you talk about a paradigm, you can think about what Lyndon LaRouche describes in his book, his prison writings in defense of common sense, a particular theorem lattice where certain axioms all work. And when you leap to a new paradigm, the previous axioms don't work anymore. And that requires a certain leap of the imagination and creativity, because what we're talking about going to is something which is not in anyone's experience. And conveying that to people in the organizing, I found to be very challenging, because we all have a tendency to want to map everything onto things that we know, or things that we are familiar with, or we have the laziness of pessimism. We say, well, that'll never happen because everyone knows it always goes this way. Well, that's not really the case. And so what I wanted to do was to share with you one of my favorite, something really very personally inspiring to me, which is some of the writings of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who people may know was a colonel in the Civil War. He was from Maine. I'm from Maine. He was actually organized choruses around Ellsworth, which is about 20 miles from where I grew up. And then he went on to become a theology and language professor at Bowdoin College in Maine. And at a certain point decided that he really had to enlist in the Union Army. And people mostly know him because of Michael Shara's book and the film on the Civil War of what he did at the Battle of Little Round Top, which I'm not going to talk about. But because I think that the reason why he was able to do what he did there comes from a certain place. And so what I wanted to start with is something from Lyndon LaRouche, which I think is really important, and particularly in the aftermath of what has happened here with Harvey, what happened very personally with Keisha's family, which affected everyone around the country and us in Manhattan, because we all felt, you know, we're hoping Keisha was going to be addressing our meeting immediately, and then this tragedy occurred, and then she was there, you know, 2 weeks later, at least by video, and never took the tragedy as a personal excuse to be morose or victimized, but recognized that there's a universality in this, and there's a universality to solving these problems so that human beings don't repeatedly go through the same disasters over and over again. So Lynn had this little paper, which people might remember, called In the Garden of Gethsemane, at the beginning of Amelia Robinson's book. And I think this is very important, because there are touchstones that can give us a clue about what we're going into, one of which is what was happening in 1989, 1990. Lynn was in prison, and the Berlin Wall was coming down. The communist system, the Soviet Union, was disintegrating. And he and his wife insisted that the breakdown of the Soviet economy was not a victory for the free trade British system, that system too was going to collapse, as we have seen, as we are in the middle of. But there were certain principles. So what he says here, I'm skipping the beginning of this, which everyone should just read the whole thing, but he said, what this leads to is this: today there is a great revolution around the world against tyranny in all forms. So far, this revolution has manifested itself within the communist sector against communist tyrannies, but it is coming here too. Wherever the divine spark of reason is being crushed by oligarchical regimes with all their cruelties, the divine spark of reason within human beings inspires them to arise, to throw off the tyranny, not of anger and rage against tyranny, but because the divine spark of reason in each person must be affirmed. We seek not merely to be free from oligarchy. We seek to be free from oligarchy because not to do so would be to betray the divine spark of reason in ourselves and in others. The secret of great revolutions, of great civil rights movements, as Dr. King's example illustrates, is this capacity which the Greek New Testament called agape, which Latin called caritas, which the King James Version of the Bible calls charity, which we otherwise know as love. Whenever this power of love, this recognition of that divine spark, setting us above the beasts, prevails, wherever people can approximate that view of the sum total of their lives, as if from 50 years after their deaths. Whenever movements arise which out of love produce people who are willing, not fruitlessly, but for a purpose to lay down their lives so that their lives might have a greater meaning. For this purpose, there you have the great revolutions of history. So I will leave that, and now I hope you'll forgive me. I brought this Kleenex actually as insurance, because if it's here, then I probably can prevent myself from crying while I read you this thing from Chamberlain, because it's you really see he was fluent in, of course, English, German, French, Latin, Greek, Arabic, something called Syriac, which I'm not sure what. He was a real scholar, and I know after the Civil War, and I'll talk about that a little bit, because as people may know, generals from both sides, both armies, went to Egypt to assist in creating the Egyptian military and building the original Suez Canal. And there are other aspects of that, and Chamberlain at that time read the entire Quran in Arabic to get an understanding of that. And I'm very, very convinced from the way that he writes that he was a great student of Friedrich Schiller, even though I never, I don't see it referenced. But I think this is important, because one of the things that happens when you're in a long battle, and the LaRouches, as people know, Lyndon LaRouche began recruiting people to this organization sometime in the 1960s, I guess is fair to say. Yeah. His first forecast was in the 1950s when he was working as a management consultant. And there are members who have been in this battle through thick and through thin from that time. People have gone to jail, people have been called names, people have had economic hardship. It's been a long fight. But there have been long fights throughout history. And sometimes in our weaker moments, people may think that this is a very unjust long fight and it's not fair and we can't continue and various things. And after I read this one report, I began to take a much different view of what it means to be engaged in a long battle. And the Civil War, of course, was 5 years. Now, this is from an early battle in Fredericksburg, Virginia, which was in 1862. It was before Gettysburg. Chamberlain was fairly new, and what happened in this battle was sort of the reverse of Pickett's charge. The Confederate soldiers had secured an area at the top of a hill behind a stone wall, and the Union Army was marching up this hill and just getting slaughtered row upon row upon row upon row. So Chamberlain writes this report. So forgive me, but I'm going to read it to you. It's going to take, he says it much more poetically than I could. The desperate charge was over. We had not reached the enemy's fortifications, but only that fatal crest where we had seen 5 lines of battle mount, but to be cut to earth as by a sword swoop of fire. We had that costly honor which sometimes falls to the reserve, to go in when all is havoc and confusion through storm and slaughter, to cover the broken and depleted ranks of comrades and take the battle from their hands. Thus, we had replaced the gallant few still struggling on the crest, and received that withering fire which nothing could withstand, by throwing ourselves flat in a slight hollow of the ground, within pistol shot of the enemy's works, and mingled with the dead and dying that strewed the field, We returned the fire till it reddened into night and at last fell away through darkness into silence. But out of that silence, from the battle's crash and roar, rose new sounds more appalling still. Rose or fell, you knew not which, or whether from the earth or air a strange ventriloquism of which you could not locate the source, a smothered moan that seemed to come from distances beyond the reach of natural sense, a wail so wide and far and deep as if 1,000 discords were flowing together into a keynote, weird, unearthly, terrible to hear and bear, yet startling with its nearness, the writhing concord broken by cries for help, pierced by shrieks of paroxysm, some begging for a drop of water, some calling on God for pity, and some on friendly hands to finish what the enemy had so horribly begun. Some with delirious, dreamy voices murmuring loved names, as if the dearest were bending over them. Some gathering their last strength to fire a musket, to call attention to them where they lay helpless and deserted. And underneath all the time, that deep bass note from closed lips too hopeless or too heroic to articulate their agony. Who could sleep? Or who would? Our position was isolated and exposed. Officers must be on the alert with their command. But the human took the mastery of the official, sympathy of soldiership. Command could be devolved, but pity not. So with a staff officer, I sallied forth to see what we could do where the helpers seemed so few. Taking some observations in order not to lose the bearing of our own position, we guided our steps by the most piteous of the cries. Our part was but little: to relieve a painful posture, to give a cooling draught to fevered lips, to compress a severed artery, as we had learned to do, though in bungling fashion, to apply a rude bandage which might yet prolong the life to saving, to take a token or a farewell message for some stricken home. It was but little, yet it was an endless task. We had moved towards the right and rear of our own position, the part of the field immediately above the city. The farther we went, the more the need deepened and the calls multiplied. Numbers, half wakening from the lethargy of death or of despair by sounds of succor, begged us to take them quickly to a surgeon. And when we could not do that, imploring us to do the next most merciful service and give them quick dispatch out of their misery. Right glad were we when, after midnight, the shadowy ambulances came gliding along and the kindly hospital stewards with stretchers and soothing appliances let us feel that we might return to our proper duty. And now we were aware of other figures wandering, ghost-like over the field, some on errands like our own, drawn by compelling appeals, some seeking a lost comrade with uncertain steps amidst the unknown, and ever and anon bending down to scan the pale visage closer. Or it may be by the light of a brief match, whose blue flickering flame scarcely can give the features a more recognizable or more human look. Some man, desperately wounded, yet seeking with faltering step before his fast-ebbing blood shall have left him too weak to move, or some quiet or sheltered spot out of sound of the terrible appeals he could neither answer nor endure, or out of the reach of the raging battle coming with the morning, one creeping yet scarcely moving from one lifeless form to another, if perchance he might find a swallow of water in the canteen still swung from the dead soldier's side, or another, as with just returning or just remaining consciousness, vainly striving to rise from a mangled heap, that he may not be buried with him while yet alive, or some man yet sound of body but pacing feverishly his ground because in such a bivouac his spirit could not sleep. And so we picked our way back amidst the stark upturned faces to our little living line. The night chill had now, this is December, had now woven a misty veil over the field. Fortunately, a picket fence we had encountered in our charge from the town had compelled us to abandon our horses, and so had saved our lives on the crest. But our overcoats had been strapped to the saddles, and we missed them now. Most of the men, however, had their overcoats or blankets. We were glad of that, except the few sentries along the front. The men had fallen asleep, the living with the dead. At last, outwearied and depressed with the whole desolate scene, my own strength sunk, and I moved 2 dead men a little and lay down between them, making a pillow of the breast of a third. The skirt of his overcoat, drawn over my face, helped also to shield me from the bleak winds. There was some comfort even in this companionship, but it was a broken sleep. The deepening chill drove many forth to take the garments of those who could no longer need them, that they might keep themselves alive. More than once I was startled from my unrest by someone turning back the coat skirt from my face, peering, half vampire-like to my fancy, through the darkness to discover if it too were of the silent and unresisting, turning away more disconcerted at my living word than if a voice had spoken from the dead. Having held our places all the night, we had to keep to them all the more closely the next day, for it would be certain death to attempt to move. As it was, only by making breastworks and barricades of the dead men that covered the field that we saved any alive. We did what we could to take a record of these men. A testament that had fallen from the breast pocket of the soldier who had been my pillow, I sent soon after to his home. He was not of my command, and it proved to be the only clue his parents ever had to his fate. The next midnight, after 36 hours of this harrowing work, we were bidden to withdraw into the town for refreshment and rest. But neither rest nor motion was to be thought of till we had paid fitting honor to our dead. We laid them on the spot which they had won, on the sheltered edge of the crest, and committed their noble forms to earth, and their sad story to the country's keeping. Quote, we buried them darkly at dead of night, the sod with our bayonets turning. That's from a poem I'll tell you about. Splinters of boards torn by shot and shell from the fences we had crossed served as headstones, each name hurriedly carved under brief matchlights, anxiously hidden from the foe. It was a strange scene around that silent and shadowy sepulcher. We will give them a starlight burial, it was said, but heaven ordained a more sublime illumination. As we bore them up in dark and sad procession, their own loved North took up the escort, and lifting all her glorious lights, led the triumphal march over the bridge that spans the worlds, an aurora borealis of marvelous majesty. Fiery lances and banners of blood and flame, columns of pearly light, garlands and wreaths of gold, all pointing upward and beckoning on. Who would not pass on as they did, dead for their country's life, and lighted to burial by the meteor splendors of their native sky? So, very tough.
What was the outcome of Fredericksburg in the battle? I mean, who won?
Well, it wasn't
the Confederates. Although the Union, I mean, see, the interesting thing, this poem that I looked up, we buried them darkly at dead of night, the sod with our bayonets turning. Does anyone know this? I think it was probably widely known in the day. It was a poem by someone named Charles Wolfe called The Burial of Sir John Moore after Corunna, which was a battle where it was the English against the French and somebody. And so this Sir John Moore basically leads his troops to fight this bloody battle while just a handful of people to fight, knowing they're all going to be slaughtered so everyone else can get on their boats and get away. And the closing line of the poem is, he died alone with his glory. But I think Chamberlain's using it here because the point is that ultimately, you know, the Union is restored, but you go through this incredible, you know, sacrifice. But everything he writes has this incredible quality to it. Yeah. And so I wanted to then to just give you that sense of what this war was like, because of course it was the Civil War. All of the fighting was very personal, and people were fighting people with whom they studied at West Point, and you know, you had people who had formerly been close friends on opposite sides trying to kill each other. And it went on and on and on, because the opportunity that presented itself at Gettysburg was squandered by General Meade, and not insisting that Lee surrendered at that point, which is, anyway, another story. So, and I'll just say, you know, we took a tour of West Point with a professor who is in military intelligence and who teaches there. And you have to, I couldn't believe the ID and everything we had to be able to go on this tour. But anyway, one of the things that he told us, which I found really interesting, is he said that in war, in almost every case, the side that wins is the side that is prepared to suffer the greatest losses. That it's not the side that's prepared to kill the most people. It's the side that's prepared, in a sense, to sacrifice the most, that the cause is so precious that you are willing to make that sacrifice, knowing that, in a sense, the world cannot be otherwise. And that certainly was the case with Grant's campaign through the wilderness afterwards. And what I wanted now to tell you, because this question that Lynn raises, the question of love and the question of justice, are really crucial and were really critical in terms of the nation not disintegrating after the Civil War, and in Lincoln's entire approach to pulling the nation together, although he was assassinated before this could really be done in the way that he envisioned. And I think this is really important because people know, Helga's been talking a lot about this paper by Graham Allison, the so-called Thucydides trap, and in 12 of 16 cases where an emerging power, you know, comes to its full power, 12 out of 16 cases are war. And there's only been 4 cases where it's not war. And I think it really misses the point. It's not the point, because there's a question of justice. And if the victorious power is just, then there's a different way that this unfolds, which doesn't have to be through war. There doesn't have, because of what China is doing. His argument, of course, is that because China is becoming so magnificent and so powerful and so developed, that therefore it is necessary that we're going to have a war with them, or that it's likely that we're going to have a war with them. And this is completely crazy, because if their superiority comes from a moral superiority, which is based on a sense of justice or a sense of what it means to be a human being or the dignity of man, then there is no need for war. But I would say that there is a requirement that the United States has to retake the principles that made us great or made us have a great potential, which we have not yet fulfilled, but which we have a potential to fulfill now. And so I think from that standpoint, I wanted to just, now having given you a taste of what the battles were like, battle upon battle upon battle for 5 years, what happens toward the end of this is another whole book by Chamberlain called The Passing of the Armies. And some of it's kind of dry and difficult because part of the reason he wrote it was a certain injustice to one of his superiors and mentors, Gouverneur Warren, who had been stripped of his whatever rank that he had because it was determined he made a mistake in the Battle of Five Forks, and Chamberlain didn't think it was really fair. And these battles, I could never quite, even with a map, I couldn't figure out what on earth was going on. They were very complicated, and I can't even imagine fighting a war where you don't have GPS satellites and no cell phones. I mean, you think about Washington's crossing, and he had they were crossing the Delaware at 3 different points, and they were supposed to have timing for people to cross at different places and arrive together. I mean, you know, and of course they didn't. It didn't matter because it was a brilliant plan and they won. But I can't even imagine this kind of warfare, and how you would know that someone did the right thing or didn't do the right thing and obeyed orders, and these poor messengers running all over the place. Anyway, so I will skip the whole big section about the last few days of the battle where Grant was sending these messages to Lee, will you surrender? And Lee was saying, no, let's just have a truce. Let's meet at 10 a.m. in Appomattox to talk about the truce, but we're not the terms of the truce. And Grant said, no, it's unconditional surrender. And then it became clear, and Chamberlain's brigade was directly involved in cutting through Lee's line so that it was clear that he was going to lose, period. So then finally they surrendered. And Chamberlain was selected by Grant, I guess, or Grant's discussions with Lincoln. I don't know how it worked, but Chamberlain was selected to be to receive the surrender of the Confederate soldiers. And there was a lot of discussion about this because, of course, the concern is how do you create the conditions where the nation can be rebuilt? And so Grant already had made a number of concessions. For example, in a battle, if you had defeated somebody, and I should just say, actually, I'll go back a little bit, because one thing he describes after the surrender are these scenes. I mean, they've run out of food and supplies on both sides, but the Confederates are in much worse shape. I mean, they're literally starving. People are starving. And so they're immediately rushing over to the Union camps, and people are looking for all their old friends from West Point and so on. And the Union soldiers really feel enormous pity for the Confederates, like the Confederate commanders send word, we need food. Can you share food? So Chamberlain decides to split the rations, even though they don't have enough, and send half their food over to the Confederate soldiers. So at any rate, this is the scene. And so Grant says, well, you don't have to surrender all of your horses, which would normally be at the end of the war, the losing side gives up everything, and the horses were their vehicles of war. But they said, no, if you can take them home and make a livelihood, then you should keep them. So we're going to let you keep your horses. Then they didn't want to surrender or they wanted to surrender their weapons, but they didn't want to do it a certain way. And Grant said, no, we can't allow you that concession. But anyway, they were very, very concerned to make sure that people were not humiliated, and that the nation, you would have a basis for the nation to be able to be pulled back together again. And so Chamberlain then describes this scene the morning of April 12th, which is the morning of the official surrender. He says, our earnest eyes scan the busy groups on the opposite slopes, breaking camp for the last time, taking down their little shelter tents and folding them carefully as precious things, then slowly forming ranks as for unwelcome duty. And now they move. The dusky swarms forge forward into gray columns of march. On they come with the old swinging route step and swaying battle flags. In the van, the proud Confederate ensign, the great field of white with the canton of star-strewn cross of blue upon a field of red, the regimental battle flags with the same escutcheon following on, crowded so thick by thinning out of men that the whole column seemed crowned with red. At the right of our line, our little group mounted beneath our flags, the red Maltese cross on a field of white, erewhile so bravely borne through many a field more crimson than itself, its mystic meaning now ruling all. The momentous meaning of this occasion impressed me deeply. I resolved to mark it by some token of recognition, which could be no other than a salute of arms. Well aware of the responsibility assumed and of the criticisms that would follow, as the sequel proved, nothing of that kind could move me in the least. The act could be defended, if needful, by the suggestion that such a salute was not to the cause for which the flag of the Confederacy stood, but to its going down before the flag of the Union. My main reason, however, was one for which I sought no authority, nor asked forgiveness. Before us, in proud humiliation, stood the embodiment of manhood. Men whom neither toils and sufferings, nor the fact of death, nor disaster, nor hopelessness could bend from their resolve, standing before us now, thin, worn, and famished, but erect, and with eyes looking level into ours, waking memories that bound us together as no other bond. Was not such manhood to be welcomed back into a union so tested and assured? Instructions had been given, and when the head of each division column comes opposite our group, our bugle sounds the signal, and instantly our whole line, from right to left, regiment by regiment in succession, gives the soldier's salutation. From the order arms to the old carry, the marching salute. Okay, so he's ordered his soldiers to salute the Confederate soldiers as they surrender, and he knows that there is going to be hell to pay for making this decision. Gordon, who is the leading Confederate general, at the head of the column, riding with heavy spirit and downcast face, catches the sound of shifting arms, looks up, and taking the meaning, wheels superbly, making with himself and his horse one uplifted figure with profound salutation as he drops the point of his sword to boot toe. Then, facing his own command, gives word for his successive brigades to pass us with the same position of the manual, honor answering honor. On our part, not a sound of trumpet more, nor roll of drum, not a cheer, nor word, nor whisper of vain glorying, nor motion of man standing again at the order, but an awed stillness, rather, and breath holding, as if it were the passing of the dead. So really something. And then he goes through and describes every single regiment and remembers all of the battles that they were all, and I'm going to skip all of that. And then he says, there are incidents of that scene which may be worth repeating. There was opportunity for converse with several Confederate generals. Their bearing was, of course, serious, their spirits sad. What various misgivings mingled in their mood we could not but conjecture. Levying war against the United States was serious business. But one certain impression was received from them all. They were ready to accept for themselves and for the Confederacy any fate our government should dictate. Lincoln's magnanimity as Grant's thoughtfulness had already impressed them much. They spoke like brave men who mean to stand upon their honor and accept the situation. General, says one of them at the head of his corps, this is deeply humiliating, but I console myself with the thought that the whole country will rejoice at this day's business. Quote, you astonish us, says another of equally high rank, by your honorable and generous conduct. I fear we should not have done the same by you had the case been reversed. That's this point, I think. I will go home, says a gallant officer from North Carolina, and tell Joe Johnston we can't fight such men as you. I will advise him to surrender. I went into that cause, says yet another of well-known name, and I meant it. We had our choice of weapons and of ground, and we have lost. Now, that is my flag," pointing to the flag of the Union, "and I will prove myself as worthy as any of you." Right? So this is what they did. Now, he talks about this, which I also found really interesting and counterintuitive, but I really think it's worth reflecting on everything that's at work in how we consider actually lifting ourselves into a new paradigm and what mankind will be. Keisha already said, and we've talked about it often with LaRouche's economics, that human beings change their species character, that when we make a leap in scientific progress and socialize it and live differently, it is as if we become a different species. And that is not just physical in terms of the way that we live, but it is moral. It is it's spiritual in the sense of it's creative. And there's a certain sadness about leaving the old behind, even as brutal and ugly and horrible as it was. And he writes about that. He says, "With this, the comedy ends in classic fashion, the stern drama of the Appomattox. A strange and somber shadow rose up ghost-like from the haunts of memory or habit and rested down over the final parting scene. How strong are these ties of habit! How strange the undertone of sadness, even at the release from prison and from pain. It seems as if we had put some precious part of ourselves there which we are loath to leave." And then just the end of this chapter I wanted to share because it reminds me so much of what Lynn says about revolution. He says, "But slowly these lingering images of memory or habit are lost in the currents of a deeper mood. We wonder at that mysterious dispensation whereby the pathway of the kingdom of love on earth must needs be cut through by the sword, and why it must be that such things as we had seen and done and suffered and lost and won, a step is taken in the homeward march of man." So, and that's not the end of the book, because then what happens is then they begin the march back. And he expresses the surrender was April 12th. The parade in Washington, D.C. was in the middle of May. It was a month later. But to get these men from so far away, and that includes from farther south and so on, they marched them at an absolutely outrageous pace. And he talked about these armchair generals who are not in the field, and you'd like to spend time when you're going by and seeing the graves and literally corpses of these battles of your comrades, and you're marching and you can't stop and do anything because you're on orders to get to a certain point by a certain point. Anyway, so the first day they're marching, and it's just absolutely hideous. It's rain and mud, and it's ankle deep and deeper, and they have to go a long distance. And he describes how they, he said at one point, "I was so naive that I thought," he says, "we were overtaken by a pouring rain which made mulch of everything. Seeking the center of the earth by a force of gravity we could fully sympathize with, it soon formed a junction in the roads and fields to the extent of 4 or 5 inches of half and half." Denominated in the Low German dialect Mudde, but later circumstances inclined travelers to transpose the superfluous final D and to put it to use as the initial prefix of a deeply descriptive adjective, which I don't know what it is. It must be some crude thing. At any rate, so they're marching in this horrible muck for miles and miles, and he said that he was naive because he thought that maybe it would be better for them to switch over and march along the railroad track, because at least they could be above the mud. But it turns out all the ties were not an even distance. So the concentration required to march on the railroad track was just so much that they got even more exhausted. Anyway, so finally, they take headquarters, and they're sleeping like on tree branches. They're trying to not, because there's no place on the ground. The ground is 4 inches in water. They're all trying to sleep. He's in front of an old mansion. He said, I didn't sleep in it. I went on the front lawn. And then what happens as he is there at the beginning of this march, he says, yeah. So finally it gets clear, it was no uncommon thing to receive a military telegram in those days, but something in the manner and look of this messenger took my attention. He rode up in front of the Sentinel and the colors and dismounted. My chief of staff went out to meet him. I think the general would wish to treat this as personal, he said. I beckoned him to the rear of our group, and he handed me a yellow tissue paper telegram. It read as I remember it. The original was kept by somebody as a memento. Washington, April 15th, 1865. The president died this morning. Oh. Wilkes Booth, the assassin. Secretary Seward, dangerously wounded. The rest of the cabinet, General Grant, and other officers of the government included in the plot of destruction. And now imagine that. Yeah. You're not even back. Right. And you get word that the president has been assassinated, and that there was a plot to assassinate all of these officials in the government. And he says, I should have been paralyzed by the shock had not the sense of responsibility overborne all of other thoughts. And then he's very, very concerned about what's going to happen to the soldiers. Are they going to decide that they have to start the war again to slaughter every Confederate soldier who was behind this? He and the other generals that are with him have a conference to discuss whether they're going to have to put the country under a military dictatorship with Grant as president. I mean, you know, this is what's going on. And then he describes, they have this Irish priest who, so what they do is before they tell the men is they send out their, the most, you know, I guess, mature guards and so on to guard the perimeter of the whole camp to make sure no one does anything rash when they break the news. And then when they feel that the whole camp is secure, then they tell people what's happened. And then later, when the funeral of Lincoln occurs, they learn what day, and they have their own funeral at this time. And the rest of the way back, they're wearing black crepe, you know, armbands and so on as they march back to the Capitol after Lincoln has been killed. So that, I think it's, you know, we tend not to think through what this would be like and what is the image, because Lincoln is no longer there and the country could disintegrate at any moment. And certainly the British would like to see that. But you also have the very, very important collaboration that was established immediately on the surrender by what Grant did, and that you have the military leadership really on both sides, largely, that perhaps not completely, but a vast majority of the Confederate generals were committed, as you saw from what the comments they were giving to Chamberlain, to, that the nation be pulled together. Now, what I wanted to do actually is shift a little bit, because there's a lot that we've written about which is extremely important in terms of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, which had been initiated by Lincoln, which was going on throughout the Civil War and is completed after this. And you had in 1776 the Centennial Exposition, and you had a real commitment, a real fight by Lincoln's collaborators and advisors through the American system of economy to build the United States and create the conditions where the nation could be unified. I wanted to just share a little bit about what I had discovered not so long ago. on the question of music in this regard, because when we first started the chorus in Manhattan, Lynn said, well, you should have a chorus of 1,500 people, which I thought was completely ridiculous, to be honest, absurd, and wondered where he would get such an idea, and how could you have a chorus that size, and if you did, would they all be able to sing anyway, and could you do anything that was possibly musical, or, I mean, what do you do with 1,500 people singing? And so then someone pointed my attention to a book that we had published, I guess around the time of the founding of the Schiller Institute, which talked about these jubilees, and there was reference to a 1,500 person or 1,000 person chorus or something. So I said, well, this is really interesting. Maybe Lynn, maybe there's something to this insane thing that he's proposing, and I can find out what it is. So then I discovered this character named Patrick Sarsfield Gilmore, P.S. Gilmore, who had been a musician who had attached himself to one of the regiments in the Union Army. He, I think, was a collaborator of Grant, but in the things that he wrote, I think it was too close to the time that all this occurred that he could really say what he was doing, or that Grant had been the organizer of this. But in 1869, so, you know, only 4 years after the assassination of Lincoln, not even, 1868, they start planning for a jubilee. They want to have a peace jubilee. And the idea of this jubilee is like 5 days of concerts. And they had done things like this had happened in England, and I know there'd been things much earlier, because a friend of mine tells me that even when Handel was alive and they were doing different performances of the Messiah, they had these wild performances with 1,000 people in the orchestra and millions of bassoons, and I don't know, these weird things. So yeah, 76 trombones, sure. So but at any rate, they had this idea that we're going to pull the nation together. We're going to have a 5-day monster concert jubilee in Boston. And we're going to invite people from all over the country to be part of this thing.
What was the date for this?
This was in June of 1869, June 15th, 16th. And it's 3 days, but I think it turns out being 5, June 15th through 17th. And they want a chorus. I think the chorus ends up being 10,000 people or something. It's really wild. They have to build the biggest building that had ever been built in the United States to house it. And the thing blew over later in a hurricane, but luckily it survived for this. Now, what I wanted to share with you is and I'm telling you this, but have in your mind's eye what has happened to these people, and you know what was going on that I was just telling you about from before. So what I found is the circulars. Now, first of all, you can imagine Gilmore going to all these people, and everybody is trying to discourage him because they say you can't afford it, it's too expensive, and how are you going to bring all these people here, and where are you going to have it, and all these reasons not to. And he finally finds a guy named Tourgy or something out of the office, I'm happy to say, of the New England Conservatory of Music, where I went to school, who agrees to do this, although I quit, rightly so. But anyway, so they send out a circular. Now listen to this, because it is amazing. And what they are doing clearly is going to it's to unify the country, but it's to create a certain classical standard of literacy across the whole nation. So this letter is written March 10th, 1869. Chorus circular number 1, and it's printed in 10,000 copies, and it's inserted in newspapers all over the country. It says, the undersigned, at the solicitation of the management, has undertaken the arrangement and organization of the chorus of the National Peace Jubilee to occur in this city on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, June 15th, 16th, and 17th, 1869. To ensure its success, it is necessary to secure the cooperation and participation of the musical people of the country. And to this end, this circular is issued. It is desirable that where no choral societies exist, they should immediately be formed to consist of not less than 16 voices, and that great care should be exercised in the selection of singers in order that none be admitted who cannot sing ordinary church music at sight, and that none be rejected who may be really available in the choruses to be sung on this occasion. When such organization is made, a president, secretary, treasurer, librarian, and pianist should be chosen, and a musical director who must be able to furnish satisfactory evidence of his fitness for the position, though it be preferable for him to visit us at Boston as soon as may be after appointment. A personal interview would be much more satisfactory. And at the same time, he could attend a rehearsal of the Boston chorus and learn the manner of producing the choruses and the tempi. As soon as such organizations are reported to us with the number of singers upon each part and a full list of officers, the music will be sent, bound in complete order, free of charge, and societies will be allowed to retain the same at the close of the festival. It will be seen in this way that each society will obtain the nucleus of a library of music for choral practice without expense, and a collection of choruses from the best oratorios of the great masters, right? So everybody in the whole country is going to have a library of choral music. In view of future similar festivals and the improvement of the musical taste of the public generally, the awakening of a greater interest in art, and the attainment of a higher standard in sacred music, these advantages cannot be too highly estimated. The choruses to be sung are the follows. Achieved is the glorious work, the heavens are telling, and the marvelous work from Haydn's creation. And the glory of the Lord, glory to God, and the Hallelujah chorus from Handel's Messiah. He watching over Israel, and thanks be to God from Mendelssohn's Elijah. Sleepers wake, and to God on high from Mendelssohn's St. Paul, see the conquering hero comes from, and see the conquering hero comes from Handel's Judas Maccabeus. Prayer from Rossini's Moses in Egypt. Luther's Chorale, A Strong Castle is Our God. Gloria from Mozart's 12th Mass. And the Inflammatus from Rossini's Stabat Mater. The proportion which it is desired to establish is as follows: 8 sopranos, 7 altos, 5 tenors, and 6 bassos. But the volume of tone in each of the parts must be as nearly equal as possible. The same proportion to be observed in the organization of either small or large bodies of singers. So I'll skip a bunch of all the details on accommodations and how they're all going to get to Washington, and not Washington, to Boston, and so on. Then he writes, it may not be necessary to impress upon the minds of the members the great importance of unity of action in, and immediate attention to this matter, and the necessity of a minute observance of the suggestions above given, for it is only by these means that a chorus of such magnitude can be perfectly organized and carried to a successful issue. It is almost needless to refer to the design of the festival, the celebration of the restoration of peace to our country, or to its magnitude. Let it suffice to say that it will be a jubilee worthy of its cause, and if it receives, as it should, the hearty cooperation of singers and the musical public generally, it will serve to advance the cause of music by bringing the masses together and inspiring them with a love of all that is noblest and purest in the divine art, and prove a musical festival such as the world has never witnessed. And at the festival, President Grant appeared. And at any rate, so all of the important political leaders of the day were at this jubilee. And then a few years later, they had a world peace jubilee where they had every nation And he describes various, I guess it was the Franco-Prussian War. Anyways, certain gestures, again, very much reminiscent of what Chamberlain did by giving the salute to the Confederate soldiers, because when they got to the French, at any rate, it was very profoundly moving. But I think this is really extraordinary, and it gives you a sense of the actual character and intent of what the United States is supposed to represent. And I think what we have to draw on if we are going to qualify ourselves to move into the new paradigm as Helga is emphasizing. So that's what I wanted to share with you.
Thank you.
Yes.
I just, what struck me is the Westphalian quality of that peace treaty. I think that's what's required, at every juncture, like we're at right now. And that's what I think hangs really on this meeting between Trump and Xi, especially, and Putin, if that happens. That this is it's about love and about what human beings are.
Yes. Yes, that reminds me, I should tell you this little vignette. 4 of our organizers from the Jersey office went to China for a few weeks. And one of them, Lainey Rubenstein, has been before, and she said that and I don't know if Helga would agree with this or not, but what she described is that her experience is that there's been a real transformation of just the culture of the population. And what she meant by this is, she said some years ago, she was on a flight, many years ago, I guess. I don't know if it was to China, Taiwan, or whatever. Anyway, she was raising her hands to put her baggage in the overhead bin on the plane. And she said, this is very typical that the Chinese people are really pushy. They're really pushy. And I have seen this because I was shocked, actually, at a concert we went to in Flushing, Queens, where the seats were taken and people were holding seats for someone who had to go park. And they would come in and they were almost having fist fights over the seats. And the security had to come and stop people from having these fist fights. But anyway, so I couldn't imagine. So this man comes up, elbows her in the ribs, makes her drop the bag on the floor, and puts his suitcase up in the overhead bin. And she said the flight attendant did come over and yell at him, and she got to, but she said that was sort of typical. But on this trip, they described it as being totally different. One, they tried to go to a lot of places, and she speaks some Chinese, which are not typical where tourists normally go and where people had not seen Americans, and that people would come up and stare at them and ask, can I practice my English? The school children would all want to practice their English. But also in some of the areas like the Three Gorges Dam or other things where there are a lot of tourists, they would know that the vendors would always like to rip off the American tourists. So various Chinese families, like one young man, got very upset. They had to take a taxi somewhere, and he said, they're going to try and rip you off. So he went down the row of taxis, someone they had never met before, and each one said, these are not regular tourists. These are good people. You have to treat them well, and you cannot charge more than X. So he went taxi driver by taxi driver until he found one who agreed that he was not going to rip them off. And then what he did is he took a picture of the guy's license plate and took Lainey's phone number and called after the ride to make sure that the guy had done it. And at the Three Gorges Dam, when it was raining, they said a Chinese family bought the rain ponchos for everybody. And then they said it happened over and over again on the subways when they couldn't figure out how to use the tokens, that people would invariably not just show them how to use it, but would end up paying for all of their fares.
Wow.
And
happiness.
Yeah, exactly. Happiness. Well, I was thinking, of the goodness of the American people, and we've lost that quality because people are under such hardship that everyone feels, I'm not going to survive. You are a threat to my survival. So people have become very stingy and resentful, as opposed to if you were relaxed, that you had a future, that you were not going to starve to death, that your children were going to have a livelihood, then there would be a certain spirit of generosity where you wouldn't feel threatened by the need of another person. But anyway, I think that's very interesting because we've seen it enough to know that there is that quality. You see it in emergencies. You described it here after Harvey. It was seen in New York after 9/11. It's being experienced by people on the ground in Puerto Rico now, that people will be very generous. They will be very selfless. They'll sacrifice in these circumstances, but we should have much more of a spirit of that all the time. And to get there requires that we get the economic shift that is so urgent, and that the American people begin to experience a very dramatic improvement in their conditions in the short term.
Diane, did you say that Chamberlain was involved in choruses also?
Yes.
And did he have anything to do with what happened after the Civil War?
That's a really interesting question. And I don't know, because he ended up being the governor of Maine for 4 terms. And then he went to New York and was involved in founding a school for design or something. He lived right at 79th Street in Central Park. So I don't know, because they did have these jubilees also in Manhattan as well. So I don't know.
Was that stadium that they built, was that in Boston?
Yes, it was in Boston. It was in the Fenway. It's near where Fenway Park is, but I guess since it all blew down, there's no record of it. But I think it was, if I'm remembering correctly, it was something like 10,000 in the chorus, 1,000 in the orchestra. They did the Anvil chorus from Verdi, from El Trovatore, and they got 100 firemen with anvils to bang these things. And they had a bass drum that was 25 feet in diameter. Oh, and the other aspect of this is that they had some of the very greatest opera singers of the day who sang the solos, because it wasn't only choral music, right? It was operatic music, and there's some incredible descriptions of the quality of singing and who could fill a hall of 40,000 people, because that's, I think, how big the audience.
No amplification.
No, of course. Exactly. A number of the opera singers involved in this were also involved in Egypt in creating the first opera house in Alexandria. Yes, exactly, for Aida and other works that they did there. Yeah, exactly. And also part of the unity at the World Peace Jubilee, they invite the Fisk Jubilee Singers was the group that was chosen to represent the nation of Russia. Which is very interesting. Yeah. Yes.
On the this idea of the magnanimity of the generals, is there any connection? I mean, that you've seen? Because the thing that came to my mind immediately is Lincoln's second inaugural address.
Yes.
And I was wondering if that is reflected in what these officers are doing, that they understand what Lincoln is trying to do.
Yes. Well, Lincoln obviously communicated. I mean, Lincoln and Grant were obviously in communication of how this was to work, and I'm sure it was of great concern how the nation would be, held together. I mean, they did, Davis hid, and you had the beginnings of the Ku Klux Klan after, because you had some people who didn't want to give up fighting, who went to try and run guerrilla warfare. And had the Union not been so magnanimous and recruited all of the military to be part of this, I think that would have been probably worse. But that was the intent of the British, and funding that was to create, you know, terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan and run a guerrilla warfare to still destroy the Union and to prevent Reconstruction. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking about how Lincoln put together his cabinet, you know, where he included Southerners,
Mm-hmm.
kept his enemies close.
Yes. His friends close and his enemies closer.
You know, it's interesting what you say about the guerrilla warfare, because having just read Bob Ingram's articles,
Mm-hmm.
it's really quite shocking, actually. And the idea that there's a guerrilla war being fought in the United States against slavery, you know, and against racism, not just against slavery, but against racism, until the Civil War. And then you say that the South, or certain elements, to continue to try to fight for a racist society as a guerrilla warfare. So I thought Bob's articles were really quite shocking in a way, you know, because he makes a pretty good argument, it seems to me, of how destructive the racism was.
Sure. Well, it was the burning issue, as he report, you know, at the because people say, how can you say, yeah, right, how can you say we're for freedom and liberty and have an institution of such as slavery?
Mm-hmm.
If you're saying that every man is created equal, then that's true. So how can you know, have this institution? And that went on until, you know, the Civil War should have ended it, but you see today, and it's perpetuated in other means. I think, you know, it would be easy to say that slavery is a question of so-called race or whatever, or religion or something like that, but it really is a question of human identity. Either you are a human being, either we are all human beings, which means we are not animals, which means we each have a unique potential for creative genius, and that's what you fight for and your government fights for. Or if you say that's not true, then you have an oligarchical system, which you see imposed through certain economic policies. If you think about the drug addiction, for example, what is that but a kind of slavery? You make people completely dependent on they cannot function. Their freedom has been taken away by the addiction.
Did you want to say something? Well, I was saying that the experience you have in China.
Not me, but my friends, yeah. Not me yet, but our chorus is going to go there. John Segerson said so.
In my experience, it was just yesterday on Facebook. There's people in Taiwan, there were different politics, and he wrote something. I disagree, so I wrote something back to him. And he wrote back to me, and then I wrote it back to him, and then he said, "You idiot." I said, "You are an idiot, and you're not even in position to talk to me." And I wipe off. So rude. The people are very uneducated.
Well, luckily,
I'm going back there at Christmas.
I
I'm going
see.
back there. Track me down. I hope somebody don't kidnap me.
Well, in the United States, no one is ever rude, especially not in New York.
It's really, it's totally different with people, what they think. And I really don't want to go back, but I have something I have to do over there. That's why I'm staying for
Right.
5 days.
But see, I
there.
think we have to get internal a sense of the happiness of being liberated from what we've been in. And our idea of it is too small. Everyone's heard this, you know, been down so long it looks like up to me, where you can't even see the developments as they're occurring. And it's sort of seeping in, because we meet on the streets and elsewhere. You meet people who've been to China, who've seen that you can actually have a subway system that goes on time and doesn't catch fire between stops and things like that, you know, that this is possible. The other thing they described, I'll say about China, which I thought was very interesting, is they said, you know, you see all these super modern high-speed trains and these super modern buildings, and there's certain areas where it's really not beautiful architecture. I mean, that's where, no, we're gonna, you know, we have to have a cultural renaissance. We have to bring beauty. But at any rate, but then they saw a guy carrying 2 gigantic mattresses on his back by hand. So because the development has been so rapid that everybody has not been, you know, hasn't changed their whole culture or lifestyle, or they're older and they still, you know, depend on whatever was the previous level of technology. At any rate, but I just think and I was watching only the beginning of Xi Jinping's address to the CPC. And one of the first things he says is, when you begin a long road, you should always remember what your intention was, what your destination was. So I'm thinking of like the Civil War, you know, what was Lincoln's intention with the Union, and how that carried throughout the Civil, you know, that it carried from beginning to end of the Civil War, that you should never go into battle if you don't have an idea of what victory is or what it looks like. Although when you arrive there, you may discover that it can be improved upon what you expected that it would be. And I think we've suffered because of the cultural pessimism, particularly since the Kennedy assassination, and then 9/11 more recently. And of course, throughout that, what was done to Lyndon LaRouche, which I think is a much bigger deal than we tend to think about, because the country would be totally different had he been allowed to be president, for example. The world would be totally different. But as a result of this, there's been a real suppression of creativity and vision. So we take for granted things today that should never have been tolerated and would never be considered acceptable. And the more that we begin to kind of inhale the idea of the new paradigm, that we're going to have a fresh sense of what we're going to fight for, what we're willing to put up with, what's considered acceptable and what's not. And, you know, you see it here with some of these silly congressmen who said, no federal government, no federal funding, no. Now they're saying, oh, we really need some big infrastructure.
I'm just, this whole idea, this beautiful conception of this jubilee, musical jubilee, that's really awesome. I mean, I was just thinking about it, you know, we got the president going to China and the opening, great potential for the U.S. to join the Belt and Road. I mean, just imagine having a World Jubilee for the Belt and Road, where U.S. joins with Russia, and then you have, then you're talking about LaRouche wanted a 1,500 person chorus. You might be up there conducting a 15 million person chorus. I mean, Russia, China, the United States, and all the rest of the world.
We won't wait you go to outer space to do it.
Yeah, yeah, we'll be doing it on the moon and Mars. Now that's really powerful, because you can think, I mean, that's something that could actually happen within the very, very, very near future, that we could have such a jubilee. That's pretty.
Yeah.
Thanks to imagine organizing such
things.
Yeah, I think that what this all comes down to is the concept of victory, as LaRouche once put it. That is, there was a clear understanding which you could get by reading the founding fathers, and also get by reading and understanding Lincoln looking back on the founding fathers, that the American Revolution was a change in the identity of human beings for the world. That after the American Revolution, what was thought to be simply theoretical somewhere in Plato was real, and that this was the nature of man and the consent of the government and a government of the people, by the people, for the people was the destiny of man, not something that might happen someday, right? That was a change in the paradigm. I mean, you can say Christianity and the Roman Empire, you can look at things, but the American Revolution was a turning, and the Civil War was another turning point, which was not realized, which was actually crushed over a period of time. It didn't happen all at once.
Right.
And now, I mean, you have these turning points in our organization that have occurred with the strategic defense, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and now with this situation, which has never before happened in history, that you've had a economically powerful country. This is what the thing that Helga is really stressing. Whatever the problems, and there's still all kinds of problems in Chinese culture, like you were just pointing out, but the idea is that this can be a realized change permanently in how human beings regard their own potential, the potential of everyone. And the singular self-conception of LaRouche's organization is we are the only ones who really understand, not just from the standpoint of defeating the British, we're out to complete the American Revolution for humanity. The Chinese don't have that conception. We do.
They have a conception of transforming the world for the good, as Xi Jinping says, by 2050, or what is 2035, 2050. Yeah, that the whole planet, people will be harmonious. But what does that mean? No, we do. But the thing I would challenge all of us on is, if you take someone like Alexander Hamilton, who came here to work with George Washington and create this republic, he was operating in a world where there had never been such a republic before. So the entire conception of what a government should look like, or how a constitution should be, you had the work of Cusa, which was very important, the Concordantia Catholica, you had Leibniz, you had all these people who clearly had been thinking about this for some time, but Hamilton, Gouverneur Morris, John J. Washington, Ben Franklin, this group of people found themselves in the situation where the rubber had to meet the road, and they had to actually create the actual government without having a quote unquote model on how to do it before. And in a sense, when Lynn said this a couple of years ago, he started saying we have to think of sovereignty differently. A lot of us found that very challenging because we've been fighting for sovereignty for a lot. Of course, you have to have sovereignty. And he says, well, no, that's not really the most important thing. We're going to have new relations among states. Maybe they're not going to think of nation states in the same way. And that's kind of, whoa, what does he mean? Well, and I think partly, what you're saying in terms of what China's doing in the US, how the US would become part of that and how that transforms the potential for this thing. But we're literally talking about a world which has never existed before. It has never existed before.
For which Lynn has been calling for since he started this movement.
Yes, exactly. So he's had a vision, and somehow we're on the brink of getting to a new inflection, a new turning point. And I think it's wisest for us to have that kind of sensation of not knowing exactly what it is, as opposed to trying to capture it or put it in something that's limited. Although you want to have definitely there's certain parameters, obviously, which is the importance of Lynn's economics. The question of relative potential population density is absolutely paramount. But that's the thing to remember. It's completely new. And our challenge is now to convey this to the people that we're talking to, who, just unfortunately are clueless, but they don't have to be. And they're, I think, can get a glimmer of it. Okay, I think, are we done? Okay, oh, there's a question back there. Do you want to?
Yes.
What?
My name is Bernard Raymond. Thank you for your wonderful presentation.
Oh, you're welcome.
And since you mentioned culture of pessimism and throughout your conversation, it comes to my mind. I attended a presentation before where somebody was saying that the way the world is right now, if we could transform the power of love to the love of power to the power of love, we could have a better world for everybody. So I would like to I would like to have your insight on how likely you think the Belt and Road Initiative will be implemented in the world.
Oh, it already is. I think it's unstoppable, frankly. And I think
Say that question again.
how likely it is that the power of the Belt and Road Initiative will be implemented in the world. And I said, I think it is unstoppable. And that's their view. I mean, you see that with what the Chinese are saying. The US has all this stupid crap and all this nonsense in our press. And they say, oh, well, they just don't really understand what's going on and they're ignorant about it. They're not even the frog in the well. Yeah, they're not really bothered by it at all. So not that obviously there's not, you know, when the transatlantic system melts down, if we don't have Glass-Steagall and certain things, that there's not a danger of war. But I have to say, I think this thing is way beyond. And Helga's point that what just happened at this 19th Communist Party Congress in China is that people don't get what's happened here. It's very big and it is very advanced, and it is way more advanced than people here wish to recognize. And the silly people who think they're going to stop it, who are really like King Canute trying to stop the waves from coming in at this point. And we'll be much happier if we will work with this. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.